What's up? My name is James McCool. This is a slate breakdown for NFL DFS Week 13. I still don't have any intro music. I'm pretty sure by the time that we get to MLB season, I will have intro music. But for now, it's just me going in cold turkey. If you have not tuned into this before, this is Mondays with McCool. Typically, I'm joined by one of Blender or I had shit my money on a couple weeks ago. I should probably find more guests to come on as well. But because neither one of Blender or Adam can make it today, we're going to have a solo show. If you guys have any questions while you are watching, just feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll bring them up. I'll answer any questions that you have about the slate in general, about the models, et cetera, et cetera. But this is probably going to be a relatively short show because it is just me. We're going to be using results DB. We're going to be using the models and like the main slate models from Paydirt. And we're also going to be using Fantasy Life, some tools that they have over there to look at, splits and you roll and usage and all that kind of shit. But first, I hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving. I hope everybody had a really good week last week. I got to host Thanksgiving. It was great. We had a whole wide spread of food, cooked my first turkey. Well, not my first turkey, but a newer version of turkey that I have done. So before we had basted it and done like the whole like butter basting thing. And this year we just did a really long salt brine. Anyway, it was delicious. It was great. We hosted the whole family. It was really nice to have the whole family there. And Margaret's family was there. Margaret's mom and dad met my mom for the first time. We've been together for 10 years. And it was the first time they ever met each other. So that was really, really nice. But, apart from the niceness that was Thanksgiving and Thanksgiving week, I got my ass kicked in DFS and sports betting for the most part. The NCAA model had a little bit of a downturn in terms of spreads. I think it was 48% right on spreads this week, which is losing numbers. Money lines were still fine overall for week 13 and 14 for the NCAA model, which, if you have not seen, is here. Overall weeks 13 and 14, I think we ended up with like a 59% win rate on money lines and 52% on spreads. So I think that it did prove out relatively well as a model that I'm going to continue to maintain going into next year. I think there are things that I can improve. But overall, sports betting was not super great in that reflection. I did not do any newsletter bets for Paydirt over the Thanksgiving weekend just because there was so much content to manage and, family was in town. So it was just hard to put on newsletters. But overall, I think there were a lot of things we got right. I think there were a lot of things we got wrong. We're going to talk about both of those things. And we're going to kind of look to see how wrong we actually were. Did well in betting, but good Lord, DFS was horrendous yesterday. I don't want to talk about it. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty brutal. So I pulled up whatever way I have to point for this. I pulled up results DB here. And as you can see, I mean, when all of the ownership here is all of the pieces that you needed for first place, like I'm probably going to do fucking bad. I was happy to fade Bucky Irving. I thought that he was generally... I think that he was fine. And I'll talk about him a little bit more in depth when we look at the models and when we go over and look at usage. I thought that the Buccaneers were going to score like 35 to 40 PPR points with their running backs. I just didn't know who it was going to be to. Bucky Irving had not been like the guy until last week. And Rachaad White was still working in. Sean Tucker was still getting red zone carries. So I wasn't like feeling great about super chalk Bucky Irving. It was a nuts matchup. I thought that he was fine in a lot of different builds. He wasn't somebody that I was like saying that you had to fade, but I thought that he was a decent fade. David Moore was the way better fade. I thought that he was about the second worst play that we've seen in DFS so far this year. And he scored 9 fantasy points. To be fair, I projected him for 8 fantasy points. I didn't think he was that bad of a play overall. The issue came in, though, that I wanted to fade him for Adonai Mitchell, who scored literally 0 fantasy points. So let's talk about that one really quick. I'm going to go over to the range of outcomes. If we sort by 4X, you can see that Adonai Mitchell was by far the best value in the Paydirt models. I had him project for 13. He was 3,900. He ended up scoring 0 fantasy points. So over in Fantasy Life, you can go to the utilization suite and go to game logs. You can also go to season logs. But typically when we look at this, we're seeing the entire range, right? And so if we look at Adonai Mitchell throughout the entire year, 75% of the routes, 28% targets per route run, 28% of the targets, 50% targets per route run. Like this dude, he's really, really good on a routes run basis. And then week 13, he has what I'm pretty sure is the lowest targets per route run of the entire year so far, and only 8% of the targets. He did have one of the 2 end zone targets thrown to him, but it wasn't a catchable pass. Just an abject failure by Adonai Mitchell. And what I will say is, like, this kind of thing, like, you just can't expect something like this to happen for the most part. Usually when he is getting routes, he is producing. Now you could say that when he had this 95% route participation, only 16%, but he still had 17% of the targets. And he's still going to end up like producing when he has 95% of the routes. So like, I don't think that the projection was necessarily terrible on him. Maybe I was a little bit optimistic. Maybe it should have been somewhere around like 10 or 11. But I still think that he was a considerably better play than David Moore. When you compare him against David Moore's baselines, he's just a way, way better, higher upside option. The guy that ended up actually doing things, if we sort this just to week 13 and we just look at week 13 performance, it was Alec Pierce. And Alec Pierce had a 29% targets per route run, 25% of the targets, 33% of the air yards. His ADOT has always been really, really big. So he had an ADOT of 21 on the season at 22.7. Only scored 9.6 PPR points, but that still led everybody on the Colts. And something that I had said when I was doing the slate breakdown with Scott Barrett when we did Slate Talk, which you can find on YouTube or over in the podcast feed, is that I didn't want to tie myself to Bryce Young. That was a big thing with David Moore, was that I didn't want to tie myself to Bryce Young, and especially didn't want to tie myself to Bryce Young with a journeyman wide receiver who just doesn't earn targets. But maybe what I should have said was I don't want to tie myself to Anthony Richardson, who had one good week coming back into the start. But then since that week, he had this 9.2 ADOT, 67% completion percentage. But then week 12, 13 ADOT, 39% completion percentage, and 12 PPR points, 42% design rush attempts. Week 13, still only a 50% completion percentage, only 25 dropbacks. And, inside the 5 attempts, like his fantasy production is still fine, but he can't throw the fucking ball right now. Like his completion percentage across the year is only 47%, in sample 52%. He's just not an accurate thrower right now. And that's not something where I'm going to say like, oh, Anthony Richardson's a bust. Like I still think that he probably, his ceiling is something like, Josh Allen. Like Josh Allen was really bad in his rookie year and has turned into being a really, really good, solid QB in the league. And not just from a fantasy perspective, but from like a real life perspective. I think Anthony Richardson can probably still get there. He has all the physical tools. He just doesn't have the accuracy right now. And, I don't know how much I want to use him throughout the year, towards the end of 2024 season. I don't know how much I want to use him if I just can't count on him to complete passes to his wide receivers. And yeah, I don't know if I can use him. I don't. It's one of those things where if you use him at this point, you're just using him naked and you're using him as a third running back, with passing touchdown upside. And the issue with that is you still should take one of his cheap wide receivers, an Alec Pierce or an Adonai Mitchell or somebody like that, and look for upside through that. But it's just it was rough, man. It was really rough. So Adonai Mitchell failed me. I still think he was the right play off of David Moore. I don't have any reservations against that. I think that he was fine. But looking at the rest of the values, like let's just sort values for Paydirt overall. Adonai Mitchell ended up failing. I projected him for 18% ownership. He came in lower than that, right? Like maybe way lower. It's filtered by a wide receiver. Where was that in image? Yeah, he came in at 10% owned. I mean, I thought that he was going to come in higher than that, especially with Anthony Richardson looking like he was going to be chalk, but is what it is. Let's see who else. So K-Dot and Hunter Henry. Let's go take a look at tight end results here really quick. K-Dot was 6. Meh. Hunter Henry with 14.5. That's pretty good. Overall, it was the Mike Evans show with Tampa Bay, which I think we probably, that's not a crazy thing to have expected. Go see what that breakdown was. So Mike Evans in week 13, 35% of the targets, 90% of the snaps. Yeah, I mean, those things make sense. Like, he's going to continue to have this kind of a season moving on. I hope that they get him to 1,000 yards so that he can continue to have like the most pleasing PFF page on the planet. But he's going to continue to be a baller. What do we have for Kate Otten though? He still had 21% of the targets. He just didn't produce on it. Like 21% of the targets, one of the 3 end zone targets. The problem was 3% of the air yards. Like, that's just not going to fly. 20% of the targets doesn't matter at all. 7 targets with an 8 out of 1. That's not going to play. Like, we need that to be higher for sure. But overall, Hunter Henry and him, I think that usage was fine overall. What else do we have here? So Taysom Hill's usage was fine. I don't need to go look at that. Chase Brown was a great play one way or another. He ended up being 30% owned. I thought that he was going to be higher than that. I had him projected for like 38% owned, and he was 38% owned in 150. Yo, what's up? Hey, how you doing? He was going to be high owned. I thought he was going to be higher owned. He probably should have smashed this week. He had a pretty decent outcome. He probably should have had a way better outcome. 92% of the rushing attempts, 61% route participation, 80% of the short down and distance snaps. He only had 1 touchdown and ended up scoring 19 fantasy points. Like 19 fantasy points, 6,200. That's going to get you there. As you can see, he was in 29% of the top 1% lineups, 30% owned. He still produced really, really well. I said that he was about the best play on the slate. I thought from a salary adjustment standpoint, like he was $2,000 underpriced based on his price. And I didn't mind building around him. If you didn't have a Chase Brown in your lineup, you should have had a Cincinnati stack. And Cincinnati stack's crushed. So that would have worked out really, really well. But I just thought that Chase Brown, if I'm going to build out 3 lineups, I'm going to have him in every single one of them. If I have 10 lineups, I probably end up having him in like 8, I would think, and then I have 2 Cincinnati stacks. I just thought, $2,000 underpriced. I thought that he was way too good of a play to pass up. Ladd McConkey. So Ladd McConkey ends up just absolutely crushing this slate. Overall on the year, got 52% of the targets. It's so fucking stupid. How do they always know? Let's just take a look at raw numbers here. So on the year, he had maxed out at 9 targets in week 11, but overall was averaging 7 targets per game, 5 receptions with an 8 out of 10, and 70 air yards. In week 13, for whatever reason, he had a 48% targets per route run, 12 targets, and 20 PPR points. No end zone targets because he didn't score a touchdown, but ended up just nuking the slate because of these 12 targets and 9 receptions, set season highs in both, as one of the highest owned players on the slate. Granted, I think that I had him projected relatively well. Did I? Yeah, I mean, 14 fantasy points, like that's within expectation. This is somebody who on the season was averaging about 14 fantasy points. I don't think that you should have expected that much more than that. Apparently people did and just wanted to lock him in and get these 20 PPR points for basically no reason. That's a pretty tilting outcome for people to get 23 fantasy points out of him. I thought that he was an okay play, but at 6K, there were a lot of options that you could have used that were not Ladd McConkey that I think were just as good of plays. And overall, I thought that Justin Herbert was overvalued. If we look at quarterback ownership, he was 17% owned. There's no reason why Justin Herbert should have been 17% owned. And all the Ladd McConkey people get there anyway because they paid for him with Justin Herbert because it was a cheap stack. Granted, Herbert only scored 8 fantasy points. So people went down with the ship on that one. But Ladd McConkey and Justin Herbert, were high owned for basically no reason. This is a duo that scores on average something around 25 to 30 fantasy points, and they scored 25 to 30 fantasy points. But Ladd McConkey, because he was so popular, ended up sinking me for the most part in late games. Very, very tilting outcome. I didn't expect to see Baker Mayfield at 11% owned. That's a little bit high. Matthew Stafford, I think I expected that. Overall, quarterbacks did bad. The high owned ones. Anthony Richardson was the highest owned that had more than 20 fantasy points, and he was only 7% owned. Like, if we sort this by points, Russell Wilson nuked 30 fantasy points. He's been great this year, by the way, for all the haters who said that I was wrong about him. Jaden Daniels nuked. Of course he did. We probably should have paid more attention to that. Lamar Jackson did very, very well, as he usually does. Joe Burrow, 25. But all these guys were less than 5% owned. In fact, every single quarterback that scored over 20 fantasy points, except for Anthony Richardson, was less than 5% owned. So it was a week to get different with your stacks. And then just surround them with the giga chalk everywhere else. Like, if you would have gone Russell Wilson with Bucky Irving and Mike Evans, who were both high owned, paired Russell Wilson with like George Pickens or Pat Freiermuth, which I think would have been fine. And then utilize Joe Mixon. Let's see. Let's start this by ownership. And then surround it with Chase Brown, Bucky Irving, Ladd McConkey, Joe Mixon, and Nico Collins. Like, that lineup would have fucked. That lineup would have been great. And I was fine with fading certain parts of that, but I wasn't on all of the right pieces around it. Played a Washington stack, but chose wrong third player. Yeah, it's hard on Washington, right? I mean, you can kind of start with Jaden Daniels plus Terry McLaurin, right? So if we take a look at this, Jaden McDaniels, Terry McLaurin, Zach Ertz, like, that was fine. I think that ended up taking down some tournaments because Terry McLaurin had 2 touchdowns. But like, it's hard when you pair Jaden McDaniels or Jaden Daniels with anybody else, with that third person. It always feels a little bit bad. Really quick, I want to talk about Bucky Irving. So let's go take a look at Bucky Irving and see if I was just completely fucking wrong about the workload here. So if we look at percentages, no, he still just had 52% of the snaps. I mean, or no, that was Rachaad White. Bucky Irving had 53% of the snaps. He did have 63% of the rushing attempts, which was the highest rate so far this season. It's 20% more. So maybe they're just finally saying, fuck it, we're going to give Bucky Irving the role, but still just 53% of the snaps. And only 33% of the routes, 9% of the targets. He just ended up really, really getting there on rushing volume alone. And he's been a super efficient rusher this year so far. But like, what I wrote in the breakdown, we can go look at that breakdown here, was that I wasn't sure who was going to score all the fantasy points for Tampa Bay. See, I think I said it. Where did I say it for Bucky Irving? I don't remember where I said it for Bucky Irving, but I said that, Carolina, I thought was going to score 30. Here it is. Overall, I'm not in love with Bucky Irving, even in a great matchup at 20% owned. We talked at length on the Slate Talk, linked at the bottom of the article, about his workload concerns and opportunity cost. That said, it is the nuts matchup, and I feel confident that the trio of White, Irving, Tucker will score 35 PPR points. I just have no idea the distribution of those fantasy points. So they scored 9, 35, 41 fantasy, or so 8, 35, 43 fantasy points overall for the running backs for Tampa Bay. It just ended up being Bucky Irving that scored the 27. I think that realistically, like, when we look at this, sure, Bucky Irving ended up getting that 63% rushing attempts, but I don't think that we could have made that assumption. I think that if you say that Bucky Irving is going to get 50% of the snaps and then give that 13% over to Rachaad White, who then would get 43% or 42%, I think it's completely reasonable to think that Rachaad White would have broken a long one and been the one that scored 20 plus fantasy points, and Bucky Irving didn't. So I don't feel all that bad about not prioritizing Bucky Irving. especially at 34% owned. At 34% owned, I feel even better about not prioritizing him. Sure, he crushed it with 30 fantasy points. Like, that's fine, whatever. But at 34% owned, I don't think there was a reason to prioritize Bucky Irving based on what we knew before the slate. Now, moving forward, if we think Bucky Irving is going to be getting 60% of the workload for rushing attempts, like maybe we want to have a little bit more prioritization on him. But even at that, he's going to be more expensive. Do you want to pay $6,500 for a guy who's getting 60% of the rushing attempts and like 8% of the targets? Like, I don't know that I want to, unless it's the absolute nuts matchup. Maybe you want to do that for him against Carolina, but even then, there's probably better plays. If we just look at running backs, and let's sort this by cost, right? So you could have played Brian Robinson for 6,100. He put up 20, and you're fine with that. Chase Brown at 6,200. He put up 19, but he was one of the best plays on the slate. Like, you're probably not playing Travis Etienne. You're probably not playing Jaylen Warren. You probably could have played Rachaad White for $500 less, and with the expected workload distribution, I think that would have been a fine play. Dropping down, there's nobody really below that you would have felt fine playing. Some people played Gus Edwards. I thought Gus Edwards was an okay play. I thought he was a little shaky. But at 4,300, if he's only 4% owned, I'm fine with it. At 17% owned, complete pass. So Bucky Irving, Rachaad White was probably the cheapest he could have gone. I think you probably could have flipped a coin on Bucky Irving and Rachaad White based on their ownership. So I don't think that's the wrong thing. But you're probably more inclined to play Chase Brown. You're fine playing Brian Robinson. I think that when you're paying up, like, you would have been fine playing Jonathan Taylor, who scored 17 fantasy points, Kyren Williams, Bijan Robinson. This was just a week where you probably would have paid up anyway. So I don't think there was anything wrong with not playing Bucky Irving. Certainly feels like he rode hot lately. I liked him a lot more last week. Yeah, I did too. And the contest Sims liked him a lot as well last week. And I actually did write him up. So that feels fine. Like, I don't mind not having Bucky Irving. Let's take a look at wide receivers really quick and some ownership here. So this week, typically what we have seen in NFL DFS this year so far has been that wide receiver has been the spot where you want to get different. Not this week. This week, if you didn't play one of the top, say, 10 wide receivers in ownership, you were just kind of fucked. 34% 1% rate with Ladd McConkey, 34% with Nico Collins, 26% with Brian Thomas, 47% with Mike Evans. Like, of the top 8 wide receivers in ownership, the top 1% rate was really, really high. If you faded them, then you were pretty much dead. So that sucks, because that's usually what I like to do, and that's why I've found a relative amount of success this year in DFS, is that it's just been easy to find differences at wide receiver. And even with all that said, right? Like, even if you didn't want to fade, or even if you did want to fade those guys, you could have played McLaurin, who was a good play. You could have played, I mean, you couldn't have played Parker Washington. Like, if you did, that's fine, but he was probably a pretty bad play. But you could have played Jamar Chase, who scored 20 fantasy points. I guess you could have played Devontae Adams. I probably wouldn't have. But there were ways that you probably could have been a little bit different. Adam Thielen at 7% owned puts up 23 fantasy points. You could have played him instead of playing David Moore. I think that was a totally fine and viable option to go with. I just didn't want to be tied to Bryce Young whatsoever. So wide receiver, if you didn't eat the chalk, you were probably fucked. Let's take a look at tight ends. Taysom Hill was the highest owned by far, 22.8% owned in the Millie Maker. I thought he was a great play. I likened him to a 5K Deebo Samuel, which I think was still the right call. He had fine usage. It's just that New Orleans ended up not needing to really utilize him much. They still have MVS, who all he does is just fucking catch touchdowns, I guess. But he still ended up with a 12% 1% rate. Like, that's fine. After him, TJ Hawkinson and K. Dotton failed, but K. Dotton, he had decent workload. It just was the ADOT was way too low. TJ Hawkinson, Minnesota was a failure kind of overall. They just played very badly overall. And then you get into a couple guys who did score fantasy points. This week, it was the week to be different at tight end and quarterback. Tight end, if you paid up for Trey McBride, which I did in one of my lineups, I had Trey McBride and Taysom Hill as a 2 tight end lineup. I thought that he was a really, really good play. I really liked paying up for him, especially with the coach speak on Marvin Harrison Jr. Just felt like a good spot to get away from him and play Trey McBride, who projected for 16 fantasy points, projected as a really solid play overall. Mark Andrews, I liked him quite a bit. I liked Baltimore stacks overall. I thought pairing Mark Andrews with Lamar Jackson made a lot of sense. And also Mark Andrews as a pivot away from David Moore made a lot of sense in the flex. If you were doing 2 tight end lineups and you played Taysom Hill plus Mark Andrews, in order to use Mark Andrews as a value to unlock the upside of Lamar Jackson, that's something that I really liked this week. We talked about that quite a bit. And then you had Freiermuth and Dalton Schultz, but all these guys, all these guys are under 10% owned. The only tight end to put up more than 10 fantasy points at more than 10% ownership was Dallas Goedert, and you just didn't need him. So you could have gotten way different at tight end. You faded Moore. You're surprised at how owned he was in the contest. For whatever fucking reason, people decided to play 20% owned David Moore. And they just didn't get punished hard enough. He still had a 17% top 1%, right? That just sucks. When David Moore, who I think the only play that has been worse this year so far has been Tucker Kraft earlier on in the year, and he got there too. Both of those plays just didn't get punished nearly as hard as they deserve to be. Anybody who played David Moore, I hope they feed back into the ecosystem. He was an awful play this week. And Blender would tell me, no, he was fine in certain, no, he's a fucking trash play. Same thing as Jalen Coker a couple weeks ago.
Blender's not on the show, so I feel like I can come in and do this.
That's my wife, Margaret, in case nobody has ever seen her. Taking advantage of just me doing the show. Yeah, David Moore, terrible play. People decided to play him at 18% owned. Thought he was tragically bad. If you faded him, I think that you're a better player than most. Unless you faded him without knowing how owned he would be, and then you just got lucky that you faded him. But yeah, really, really bad play. So overall, I don't know. I got stomped this week. I did have a chance of cashing and recouping some losses, but I would have needed AJ Brown and Zay Flowers to just absolutely nuke, and Taysom Hill. And I needed Bucky Irving to not nuke, right? So there was like a 30-second thing where AJ Brown dropped a pass, Taysom Hill got carted off the field, and Bucky Irving scored a touchdown. And at that point, I was like, well, we're fucking on to Cincinnati, right? Yeah. You know who's cute? You're cute, baby. You're cute. We're on Cincinnati. We're going to play Showdown tonight. If you have not checked out the Showdown models, then you absolutely should. I'll have them loaded up a little while after that. But that's going to do it for me. Like I said, it's going to be a really short show today. It's just me. If you guys have questions or want to talk about the lineups that you built, if you want to ask about the lineups that you built in the Discord, I am happy to break them down over there. Discord is free to join. But thank you guys for tuning in. I appreciate it. Again, this has been Mondays with McCool. This has been a solo show. You can find me on Twitter at Paydirt_DFS. And you can find all my stuff over at PaydirtDFS.com. So thank you guys so much. Let's crush the Showdown slate tonight.